The furnace was a throat of orange light that swallowed the wind and spat it back as heat. Sparks climbed like small, angry stars, and the air tasted of iron and oil and the faint metallic tang of old blood. Men and women moved through that light like figures in a ritual. Sleeves rolled, faces streaked with soot, voices low and precise. Overhead, the rafters trembled with the rhythm of hammers and the long, distant thud of presses. Outside, the snow lay in the yard, gray with dust and studded with frozen scraps that had been dragged in from the railway sidings, from ruined warehouses, from fields where tractors had been abandoned when the front came too close. Inside, in a hall that had been a tractor shed before the war, they were making tanks. Before the plant took that name among the people, before children called it Tankograd in whispers and songs, no one had wanted the scrap. It had been the useless leftovers of a peacetime economy, bent rails, twisted frames, the husks of machines that had outlived the factories that made them. But when columns of smoke began to mark the horizons of Western Russia and men in dark uniforms demanded something that could turn the course of battles, the scrap became a source. The plant learned to read the language of ruins. What could be straightened? What could be reforged? What would become armor? And what would become fuel? If there was a single voice to represent that terrible, stubborn learning, it belonged to Pavel Ivanovich. He had the narrow, resolute face of someone who had spent his life between furnace doors and drawing boards. In peacetime, he had been a metallurgist at a tractor works, a caretaker of steel. In wartime, he became something else, an interpreter of emergency, a man who could look at scrap and say which part of a tank's skeleton it could become. He held the plant's attention not by charisma, but by an accumulation of small, stubborn certainties. How much chromium to add to a batch, how a particular slag would behave under a press, how quickly a hull had to be quenched to avoid brittle failure at -20 outside the plant gate. They called him Pavlik in the shop because Russian speech made smallness into an affection. The men answered to the diminutive as if it shortened the distance between them and the thing they feared most, failure. He slept on a cot in a corner of his office for months, waking to the cough of the boiler and the occasional distant boom of distant artillery. His hands were permanently stained a color no soap would take out. He kept unsent letters in a drawer, paper with the smudged handwriting of a wife, and a name he had not answered in weeks. Those letters were private, a compartment he shut when he went back onto the shop floor. There, under the orange throat of the furnace, he was elemental. The plant itself was a creature of compromise. Its blueprint was a compromise of rust and improvisation. Cranes from a disused mill, presses converted from agricultural machinery, molds repaired with whatever steel could be spared. Women who a year before had tended looms now adjusted valves. Young boys who had helped their fathers in oxen teams had learned overnight to read schematics. The women often moved like water through the space, balancing meters and bearings with hands quick and precise. One of them, a design engineer named Irina Sokolova, had been at the institute when the evacuation orders came. She arrived with her portfolio, her hair pinned neatly beneath a scarf, and a new, improbable task: remake the plans for a tank so that it could be assembled on equipment designed for tractors. "We will teach these machines to be tanks," she said the first day, voice steady. "If a press was meant to step a plow, it will step a hull. If a lathe turned a spindle, it will turn a shaft for an engine. We will teach them to make what the front needs." There was humor in the shop, in short, sharp bursts. A joke about ration cards, a shared cigarette in the dark during a midnight shift, the small ceremonial passing of a can of soup. But the humor never unclipped itself from necessity. It was always braided with the knowledge that each mistake had a cost. Samuel, Sasha, Orlov was 17 and had a wound in his shoulder from a fragment that came with the news of a village burned behind the front.
He had been a mechanic at a kolkhoz and had come to the plant because metal courted him. He liked engines the way some men might pray. He worked in the press bay, bending plates until his knuckles throbbed. There was a photograph of a sister he kept folded in his pocket, and he carried it like a token that kept the world for which he fought small and bright. Their problem was cruelly simple. Make the T-34 in numbers, cheaply and reliably, with materials that often refused to cooperate. The T-34 was admired for a dozen technical reasons. The sloped armor that made shells glance off like rain off a roof. The diesel engine that burned heavy fuel and would not catch fire as readily as gasoline. But in the freezing reaches where the plant stood, admiration was beside the point. Admiration did not make armor plate out of a damaged railway girder. Admiration did not convert the blueprints into 1,000 working tanks. The scrap arrived in wagons and on the back of trucks, under the watchful eyes of supply officers who had learned to accept improvisation as policy. Rail cars that had been shelled were cannibalized for suspension parts. The thick plates that once lined grain silos were hammered and heat-treated to become hulls. Sometimes the work began with an argument. An officer would say the metal was too pitted. An engineer would say it could be turned if annealed correctly. That is where Pavel's voice mattered.
He could read the grain of steel as if it were a patient's pulse and prescribe treatment, soak in a bath long enough to remove stress, temper with a particular quench to avoid microfractures, add vanadium from a small cache the plant reserved for critical batches. The first winter of the plant's conversion, they learned the limits of necessity. A batch of drive shafts, pressed from metals salvaged from a collapsed factory roof, failed during a cold test. A tank intended for the front, a hulking, dark thing with fresh paint and the bright expectation of men who would ride inside it, broke down shortly after leaving the road. The crew wrote back a terse report, and the word arrived like a hand to the throat of the plant. One failure, they were told, could mean lives lost. "Why did you not test under load?" asked Colonel Mikhailov when the officers came through the plant. He was a man who wore the uniform of discipline like armor. Military men brought deadlines, and sometimes the illusion that deadlines were simple arithmetic, where engineering was poetry. The plant had hours, not just days. Timelines measured not in months, but in the cadence of attacks. Pavel answered with a small, patient voice. "We tested what we could," he said. "The metal gave a hairline the size of a breath. It will not hold if we do not change the quench." He knew that the quench would slow delivery. He also knew that a quench could save lives. So they adapted. The plant learned to think like a battlefield surgeon. Triage the scrap. Pick the parts that could be saved with minimal intervention. Call upon the small reserves of alloying elements kept in the vault for things the plant could not do without. When not enough manganese was available, the men who understood chemistry measured their hand in fractions and improvised substitute processes. Multiple passes of heat and cold until the metal would accept the shape they required. They learned to accept that a tank made of reused metal would be different but not necessarily lesser if formed by knowledge and care. There were inventions like conversation. Harold Wentworth was not his real name. He was an engineer who had come from a northern works and whose accent the men found curious. He had slept poorly in the first nights, and on the second morning he produced a small drawing at a table that had been used for lunch. On it, in cramped, urgent script, was an idea. A modified fan for the engine's cooling system that would allow a V-type diesel to run at higher RPMs without overheating, in the halting, dusty roads of the rear. "If we can force air like a breath into the center," he said, tapping the paper, "we may run the engine harder when it needs to move quickly. That will save people when the road becomes chase and the hours count." Irina nodded.
"We must ensure the fan does not feed dust," she said. "Dust will be like teeth in the bearings." They tried and failed a dozen times before the fan worked. The failures were not spectacular, no single error, no sudden breakdown that would fill the pages of other histories. They were small, cumulative annoyances. A bearing that warmed a degree too much, a rivet that eased itself loose, a coupling that refused to stay true under vibration. In a way, that is where the heroism lived, in the patient repetition, in the hundreds of hands that tested, adjusted, and tested again until the parts sang together. The test cells were harsh places. Engines ran while technicians sat with clipboards and thermometers, reading gauges like prophets reading futures. The roar of diesel and the spat of hot oil formed a kind of liturgy. Test crews, men such as Robert Kane and others with names that had been given to them in the shop, spent nights on benches, listening for the particular hitch that meant a bearing was going. They smelled the air for the acrid note that meant combustion had turned sour. When a machine began to breathe right, the room held a hush that was almost tender. They would clap once, and the applause would be like a release of tension. Outside, the world measured the plant's worth in different terms. On the front lines, soldiers credited the T-34 with the capacity to change the map. It was true in the aggregate. T-34s, in numbers, changed calculations. But inside the plant, the moral calculus was more intimate. There was a moment in late spring when a convoy of newly completed tanks rolled out under a clear, cold sky, smoke curling from their exhausts, and men who had pressed the plates and riveted the armor and sewn the seat covers climbed into cabs to check panels and radios. A young crew of 3 men from a village beyond the river took possession of one. They were touchingly small in the world of steel, hands calloused, eyes too young. They readied provisions, put a small icon inside the cab, an object whose presence was not a theological statement in the factory, but one of those small human acts that edge the imagination, and set off toward the line. When word arrived weeks later that one of the tanks had held in contact and saved a village from being overrun, a silence spread through the bay, and then, somehow, a quiet rejoicing. They did not claim credit for all the victory. No one there believed such things. They claimed instead a brief, restrained pride. The knowledge that what they had made had done the work it was intended to, imperfectly, humanly, and with the terrible consequence that it had been used in war. That consequence tugged at the plant as a constant, ambiguous presence. The shop windows sometimes framed the countryside where columns of refugees moved like a slow brown river. Men came back from the lines with faces that had seen too much. The plant had a first aid room and a small, difficult hospital where those wounded in training mishaps or road accidents were tended. Sometimes it was used less for accidents and more for the casualties of a war that reached into even the rear by way of scarcity and disease. Pavel would stop by the wards in the evening, hands deep in his pockets, and there named the dead in his thoughts without saccharin. A young welder who had been struck by a press, a driver who had frozen to death on a supply run. There was no melodrama in his mourning, only the persistence of memory and a determination that the work be done well. The plant's culture hardened into rituals. There were the morning briefings where the foreman would read orders and take questions. There were the quiet moments when men exchanged bread and black tea at a table. There were the lists of components pinned to boards, names written with care, deadlines scrawled in ink that had been diluted to make it last. When a shipment left, a small ceremony of sorts occurred. Someone would mark the crate with a number, a team would clap, someone would whistle a thin tune. The sound was not triumph, but continuity. It said, "Our hands made something, and it will go where it was needed." In one corner of the plant, a band of craftsmen specialized in dealing with armor plates that had been bent beyond the point ordinary presses could handle. They set up improvised dies and learned to coax steel into shape with heat and the patience of people shaping stubborn wood.
Their leader was a taciturn man named Oleg, who had been a shipwright before the war and understood the language of curves. He would stand with a flame in one hand and an anvil under the plate, singing under his breath as he worked, a habit that had more to do with steady rhythm than anything else. His group turned piles of scrap into the graceful, sloped facets that made the T-34's hull an object of engineers' poetry. The plant also received visitors who carried the cold logic of strategy. A young commissar named Alya would come through with propagandists and engineers, measuring productivity in quotas that sometimes felt irresolved in the face of the plant's daily improvisations. She asked for numbers and fast reporting, and sometimes her presence shook loose resources, a crate of bearings here, a sack of alloying elements there. But she also read reports that the plant was slow or too meticulous and would chide them for not producing more. It was a pressure that had a corrosive edge. The plant learned to present itself in ways that balanced reality with expectation. They reported feasible numbers, saved the marginal gains for critical batches, and always kept a reserve of honesty to avoid catastrophic overreach. The days grew into months. The plant's apprenticeship programs became a kind of informal academy. Men and women who had never held more than a plowshare now could tighten a gearbox, measure a hardness with a file, and estimate the temper of a newly poured casting almost by ear. They taught each other in shifts, trading the knowledge as if it were bread. There were also moments when the older hands would speak in low voices about the future. What sorts of peacetime machines would be built when the guns fell silent? How the country would patch itself together? Those conversations were furtive because, in their heart, everyone knew that the future was a fragile thing that could be broken in the next battle. In the design office, maps and blueprints lay in stacks. Here, the abstraction of war's needs became tangible. One afternoon, Irina and Pavel argued over a modification to the suspension. They had found that the standard bogie tended to seize in the mud that marked a recent push line. If we allow a wider track and lighten the bogie by cutting the stubs, we might improve mobility on soft ground, she argued. But it will change the balance. Pavel tapped the table. We have to think of where the tanks will go, he said. Not where our drawings live in safe rooms, but where the snow turns to swamp. Mobility means survival. They changed the design accordingly and sent the revised parts to the shop. It was a small thing in the ledger of the war, but for the men in the field it became a matter of life. One driver later wrote, in a letter that arrived folded and thin, "We went where others could not. The tank that came for us had tracks that ate the mud. We owe you our feet." Letters like that arrived irregularly and were passed around the plant as talismans. They were a medicine as powerful as any quench bath. A mechanic who had tightened the last bolt of a turret would hold the note, read it beneath the coal gaslight, and feel for a moment that his hands had stitched connections between maps and lives. They did not stop the sorrow that the war carried, but they made it bearable. The plant's moral landscape was not uniform. There were nights when the singing of the men and women in the shop had an edge of triumph so bright it almost sounded like denial. There were other moments when newscasts spoke of cities burned, and the plant's people watched in silence. Sometimes they spoke in heated rooms about whether their work, however necessary, was righteous. "We make machines," said one older worker, "and those machines decide battles. But decisions are elsewhere. We make them without being their judges." In the end, most found a middle path. We do the work as carefully as we can and leave the judgment to history. A crisis arrived in the form of an unexpected testing failure in spring. A column of tanks being readied for deployment suffered gearbox failures after long marches across icy roads. It was an engineering puzzle that could not be dismissed as a material deficiency alone. The problem, engineers realized, had roots in the way the transmissions were assembled under pressure in a rush of deadlines. A tolerance that was acceptable in the factory's original tractor designs now became fatal in the demands of tank warfare. Gears ground against each other, heat built, and the ships of war stalled on the roads like wounded birds. The plant reacted in the only way it knew how. It called every craftsman it could spare and turned the assembly bay into a rectification line. Teams took apart every transmission destined for the front and inspected bearings, reground shafts by hand, and ran them in test rigs for hours longer than usual. Oleg and his men worked side by side with the younger crews, teaching techniques that would reduce friction and distribute load more evenly. The work extended shifts into nights that tasted of coffee and oil. Men who had been pressed into wartime labor found a new pride in these corrections. Their hands learned to feel the slightest misalignment and to set it right. When the corrected transmissions returned to the field, they ran better. The front reported fewer stoppages. The plant, which had feared that these failures would become a stain it could not wash away, was reassured. But the comfort was tentative. For each problem fixed, new ones appeared. The metal was a living argument, always offering new conditions under stress. The climax of the plant's tale, what history would remember, came not in a single machine, but in the endurance run that proved their methods. A batch of tanks had undergone the new treatment, with reinforced gearboxes, redesigned fans, and armor plates formed from the hardest of the salvaged stock. They were run together on the proving ground in a trial that was both technical and symbolic. If these could run through a simulated campaign length without failure, they were ready for large-scale deployment. The day of the endurance run dawned thin and brittle. Men who had worked months without sleep stood along the perimeter, breath smoking in the air. Engines idled like beasts in the sun. One by one, the tanks rolled out and the trial began. At first, everything was ordinary: the rattle of tracks, the hiss of steam and diesel, the sigh of springs. Then came the long hours. The tanks climbed rough berms, crossed mud that grabbed at their treads, and crawled into simulated villages where the suspension took punishment. Heat built in engines and brakes. Oil darkened and ran. The technicians watched gauges like captains at a storm. As noon passed into afternoon, a strain began to show in several machines. Bearing temperatures rose, a seal leaked, a hydraulic line went slack. For a breath, men felt the old terror that a failure would unravel months of labor.
Then the teams moved like a practiced crew on a ship in distress. A seal was swapped, an emergency oil top-up was administered, a replacement bearing fitted with hands that had done nothing else for hours. Irina stood with a thermocouple and a clipboard and did not smile. She only watched, eyes narrowed, counting the minutes. The tanks completed the hours. They completed long stretches of continuous operation without the kind of catastrophic failures that had haunted prior runs. When, at last, they returned to the yard under a sky that had turned the light to steel, the crowd was small and reserved. But in its reserve, there was a kind of worship. Men exchanged glances that meant, "We have done it." News traveled fast beyond the plant. The high command took the data and the orders changed. The plant would increase production. For the first time since the conversion, the plant had passed a trial that would be used as evidence in higher offices. The victory was technical, contained in tables of stress and numbers of hours. But to the workers, it was as real as any flag, proof that their labor could win those slender, material battles that fed into the larger tides of war. Yet the triumph had no clean edges. The tanks would go to places that meant death for many, and the plant's people understood that. When a delegation of local women arrived to lay flowers by the gate in a makeshift ceremony for the men who would go to the front, an old worker, his face mapped with lines of years and soot, bent to speak to a young recruit. "We make things," he said, "and those things are tools. Whether they build or break depends on who holds them."
The plant's work continued, relentless as weather. In the late autumn, with a sky low and purple, a train left the yard with a long string of tanks bound for a railhead toward the front. Pavel stood on an embankment and watched until the last car had vanished into the gray distance. He felt, briefly, the vertigo of being both maker and witness. The plant would go on making. The men and women would continue to fold themselves into the machines they made. After the war, rooms in the plant would become quieter. Machines that had been clattered into service would be mothballed, repurposed for peacetime. Children would come to see the tanks as museum pieces, and their mothers would tell stories of how their fathers had bent metal into armor, and how that armor had its own ambiguous legend. The plant would bear plaques, names carved into stone, a catalog of those who had labored and those who had not returned. For now, the story was still in motion. In the canteen that night, with a thin stew steaming in tins and a radio whispering news, the people of the plant spoke in softer terms than before. They spoke of homecomings they hoped for and of arms they had steadied on enemy lines. They spoke of the small inventions that had saved tanks and lives, the modified fan, the hand-ground gearbox, and of the men who had taught them.
They wore fatigue and pride together like a single garment. Pavel sat with Irina and Oleg and read aloud a letter from a driver who had written that the tank had been their village's roof for 2 nights, that in it they found shade and shelter. The men listened and, in an odd, unadorned way, were consoled. Outside, the snow would come and go. Inside, the furnace would be tended, the presses would sing, and the plant would continue to take the unwanted scrap of a broken world and turn it into something that could change the shape of battles. It was not a fairy tale of manufacture. It was a ledger of choices and techniques, of small human triumphs and the heavy moral weight that accompanied them. The T-34s would roll on, and history would fold their names into the broad sweep of events. Within the plan, however, the story would remain intimate. The rhythm of hammers, the taste of metal on the tongue, the quiet joy when a gearbox ran true. A train would load again tomorrow. Men and women would line the rail, as they always had, to watch another long string of tanks disappear toward the east. They would keep the lists, the blueprints, the worn pieces of steel that had become something else. And they would keep, too, the memory of hands that had bent and shaped the world at a time when little else could. If you found this account resonant and would like to see more stories of the people and places behind wartime industry, consider subscribing and sharing. These histories are not only machines and maps, but the lives stitched into them. Dawn came thin and blue through the factory skylights, a blade of light that moved slow as thought across machines still warm from the night shift. Men and women arrived with mittens wet from the walk, breath clouding the yard, and the plant took them in as it always had, with a rough, indifferent welcome. The presses waited, the furnaces hummed, the lists hung in the office window like verdicts. They found, taped under a tired handbill about hours and rations, a telegram. It was small, 2 lines folded into a broader rectangle, but when the foreman read it aloud, the sound of his voice spread like a change in weather. Sergei Pavlovich Ivanovich, missing in action. Last seen near Kirov. Official notice, presumed killed. There were other names on the wall, but the way people clustered at that telegram made the space around it oddly private. Sergei had welded armor plates on the second shift for 8 years. He had been broad-shouldered and taciturn, with a laugh that began in his chest and came up slow. He had shown a photograph of his wife once, the paper creased and thumbed as if it had been read for comfort in a pocket all winter. Silence did not fall, exactly. It rearranged itself.
Irina stood where she had been standing when Pavel read the driver's letter, by the tin cup where people rinsed crumbs, and she felt the letter grow colder in her hands,
as though the driver's words had been stamped with something real and brittle. Oleg went to the window and looked out without seeing the yard. The old worker who once bent to speak to a recruit wiped his hands on his apron and walked away to sit alone on a bench. The plant, for all its necessity, was not a shield against grief. It converted grief into an economy. A moment of silence, a list crossed out, an extra ration of tea brought to a widow, a name added to the ledger that would be carved on a plaque. But grief also lived in the way someone would tighten a bolt twice, as if extra care might rebind whatever had loosened in a world of shock. Sergei's absence became visible in small, practical ways. His toolbox untouched beneath his bench, the place where his cigarette tin sat, now clean of ash. Those who worked beside him made a point of speaking less, as if sound itself could snap. At noon, a delegation of the plant's elders asked for a meeting in the chief engineer's small office. The chief, an earnest man named Anton, sat behind his desk with a cup of cooling tea and the weight of timetables in his hands. They brought new orders from a higher command, an alteration to the suspension that would allow tanks to carry heavier stores across mud, a change not in the drawings that had tested by the standards, but demanded by a field report that returned from a unit near Kursk with a hand-scratched note and a smudge of blood. "The field says they need more space for ammunition and fuel," Anton said, his knuckles white on the porcelain. "They say the extra stores kept them alive through the night. But the change will raise the center of mass. We risk rollovers. We risk losing the tank in a ditch. But they write we could not spare less weight. And who are we to say? They were in the vehicle, not in the office." Oleg argued for caution. "We tested what the drawings allowed," he said. "We built to spec. If we change now, we risk the stamping line. We risk production. We risk people losing their jobs for missed quotas." His voice had the quickness of someone who measures risk by shifting variables. Pavel listened, and then he took out the driver's letter that had soothed them last night. He read aloud the line about shade and shelter, how the tank had become roof and hearth. "If a man tells us his shelter failed because he could not take something he needed," Pavel said, "then perhaps what we called risk becomes necessary. We are not making monuments, we are making roofs." The engineers argued through smoke-thin hours of the afternoon. They broke the problem into increments, as if the moral question could be solved by simple division. A quarter-inch plate here, a lighter bolt there. Anton looked at the ledger, then at the list of names taped above his desk. The small modification kit, pouches of lighter alloy, instruction pamphlets, and a spanner with a stamped ring to show the plant's mark was sent with the next train. They pinned a small card to each kit, "From the hands that kept the doors of our towns closed." Letters came back from the front with mixed news. Some were consolation in color, stories of camaraderie, of a tank saved by a quick hand. Others were terse and mechanical. Unit engaged, heavy losses, returning to hold position. The plant pinned them on the board next to the timetables. They made a map not of roads, but of absences and survivals. Outside the plant, the town rearranged itself around these transmissions. The commissary had a new bulletin about fuel allocations. Girls who had been students months before took positions in the office, filling forms with the same solemnity they had once applied to penmanship. The church bell tolled in a register that felt surprisingly contemporary with the factory whistle. Both measured time and loss. Irina, who had always been particularly attentive to hands, began to visit the makeshift infirmary more often. Her father had been a medic, and she had grown up with the small consolations field dressing could give. Cotton wool, clean bandages, the way a steady hand could make the world seem repairable. She knelt by the cot of a young driver who had come back with frost-bitten fingers and tended blisters with a care that made the man's teeth unclench.
He looked at her, bewildered, as if tenderness were a rare apparatus he had not expected to find near the furnaces. When she folded his sleeve back, she saw the faint crescent of a hasty tattoo on his forearm. A child's name, perhaps. "Do you have family?" she asked. He nodded. "One sister. She writes poetry." The man's voice had a softness that frightened him. Pavel watched these things and thought often of the future he felt pressing like a heavy hand on the back of his neck. He was not the sort to speak of ideals. He measured his days by torque and tolerances, and by the way the floor took the imprint of boots. But at night, after the machines had cooled and the steam had bled from the pipes, he would sit with Oleg and the old worker, whose name, Sergei Vasilyev, was itself an archive of memory, and they would talk about what might come after the stamping stops. The old man liked to imagine the plant becoming something else, a workshop for plows, or a place where children could learn to read blueprints instead of ammunition counts. "We have to believe," he would say, "there will be hands left to teach." There were moments when that belief seemed naive, and in those moments the plant was mercilessly practical. One evening, a delegation of strict men from a commissariat came with a ledger and a list of missing parts. They accused the plant of hoarding critical components, small bearings and springs that, if diverted, could hamper the line.
"It sat in the sleeve of my jacket through the battle. When we made shelter in the wreckage, it felt like a bridge." They listened, and somehow the story of what the plant made and what the front used folded upon itself. The tank that was roof for one man might be the instrument of another's death. The drawing had been a child's wish and a soldier's talisman. The plant had made both possible. No single conclusion was comfortable. That night, Pavel walked home along the icy canal. He saw children playing, their cheeks flushed, making miniature tracks in the snow with a broken sled. He thought of the cart with the repaired wheel, and of Marta's thin face, of the old man carving names into a plaque, of Mason's driver keeping a child's drawing in his jacket. The plant had turned raw metal into protection, into instruments that carried the weight of people's lives. He felt both pride and a kind of fatigue that lived under the sternum, a steady pressure like the push of a press. He reached his building and paused at the doorway. Above the street lamps, the sky was the color of iron left out in rain. He thought of the train that would leave tomorrow with its new kits and the men who would try to mount them by hand under whatever weather the world offered. He thought of the telegram nailed to the office window and of the names that would be carved into stone one day. He entered, and the heat wrapped around him like an old blanket. And for a moment he allowed himself to imagine the plant in peace, as the old worker had dreamed. Machines idled, children learning, people reading blueprints for plows. It felt distant, but not impossible. In the morning, another list went up on the board. This one bore no telegrams, only thanks and requests. It included a plea from a unit that had adapted Pavel's instruction sheet and found, under hard winter conditions, that the modification had indeed saved a crew member trapped by a shifted turret. There was also a note from Anton's sister thanking them for the mitten stitched by Anya, and a small anonymous envelope containing 2 rubles tucked under the ledger. The envelope had no signature, but it was enough. The plant, in all its flawed and hurried ways, had become a small polity of kindnesses. They continued to make things. They continued to argue about how to make them. They continued, in the margins of production, to bind each other with acts that no blueprint could catch. A patched cartwheel, a drawing tucked into a pocket, a field modification written in plain language. Each act was a decision to bear some small part of what the war required and to soften it where they could. The machine sang, and the hands answered. The world outside took what it wanted. And in the low hour between midnight and dawn, when the plant's lights bled into the snow and the town slept, a young apprentice named Mikhail,
began to draw.
He sketched plans not for armor, but for a simple plow that could be manufactured on the same line with a few changes. He drew it with a shy hope, afraid to name the future, but certain enough in his hands to make himself get up the next day and show his drawing to Anton. Anton looked at the lines and did not laugh. He put the drawing in his pocket and, for the first time in many months, made it a part of the ledger of plans. The factory kept breathing then, the great rhythm of presses and hammers and small mercies, until it would not be needed in the same way. Until a time when names on plaques would be read by children who had never known the tremor of wartime, and the old hands would teach new apprentices not only how to meter torque, but how to keep the fragile inventory of kindness that a community needs. For now, the plant was alive, making its choices in steel and sorrow and, occasionally, in tenderness. The train would load again tomorrow, and the men and women would line the rail to watch it go. They would carry with them the small modifications, the letters, the knitting. They would carry the knowledge that a tank could be shelter and a weapon both, that a drawing could live longer than a man. They would carry the practice of choosing, day after day, how to make what the world demanded of them. And they would continue to do that work, hands steady in the gray light, shaping metal and, in doing so, shaping the faint contours of a life that might one day become peace.